back and rise to new heights like the politicians and the media have been trying to convince you. This global recession, or more accurately, this global depression that we've been in this past 5 years, is not a temporary downturn. It's the beginning of the end of an era. If you're watching this video, you're probably curious as to when the system is going to unravel. However, this question can't be answered without looking at the why. The why will determine the how, and the how will determine the when. After the crash of 2008, a lot of people suddenly started caring about things like monetary policy, national debt, and central banking, and they began educating themselves on these topics in order to understand what was happening, and to get some idea of what was coming. In response, scores of internet pundits and self-made economists rose up to answer their questions and to predict when and how the system would fall. Unfortunately, many of these would-be teachers were promoting an outdated worldview that left out the most important variables, and as a result, their predictions fell flat on their face, over and over again. For example, when the Federal Reserve began flooding the economy with cash through the bailouts and its series of quantitative easing, many predicted that this would quickly lead to hyperinflation. America was about to become the next Weimar Germany, or Zimbabwe. Soon we were going to be carrying wheelbarrows full of cash to the grocery store just to buy bread. Many predicted this would happen by the summer of 2009, others by mid-2011. Of course, they were all wrong. Why? They were wrong because they didn't understand what actually gives the dollar value. It's true that the US dollar is debt-based, and it's not backed by gold or any other precious metal. And it is true that when money is created as debt, it comes with interest, and the money to pay that interest never exists. Therefore, it is inherently a Ponzi scheme doomed to fail from the start. However, it's not entirely accurate to say that the dollar is backed by nothing. The US dollar, which is the world reserve currency and therefore affects everyone on this planet, is backed by two things: oil and the US military. After Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, he immediately began brokering deals with every member of OPEC, offering military protection in return for them only selling their oil in US dollars. By 1975, every OPEC nation had been brought into this agreement. From that point on, if you wanted to buy oil in the international markets, you needed Federal Reserve notes. And that meant that America could now print out as much funny money as they wanted. And the rest of the world would still have to use it, just as long as no one in OPEC backed out. This arrangement is called the petrodollar status. This is what prevents the dollar from going into hyperinflation, like a normal currency might. That's not to say that running the printing presses like madmen has no effect. The dollar has lost a great deal of its perceived value since the 1970s. However, the inflation and economic effects of the Federal Reserve's policies are not proportional to what you would see if a country like Australia were to do the same thing to their currency. This is due to the fact that the demand for dollars created by the petrodollar status mitigates inflation to a large degree by distributing the consequences globally, rather than merely affecting the United States. Essentially, America gets to write hot checks, and the rest of the world has to pay the bill. Now, this gig is perfect for the US as long as no one decides to buck the system, like Iraq did in 2000 by starting to sell their oil in euros, or like Libya did by trying to pull most of Africa off of the dollar, or like Iran is doing now. As long as the US military is able to crush or intimidate any major oil-producing nation that defies them, the petrodollar arrangement will stand, and the dollar will retain its position. What this means is that the economic collapse cannot be predicted by looking at stock market charts, interest rates, GDP, or any of these other standard economic indicators, because as long as America has the power to write hot checks at the entire planet's expense, they're going to keep bailing out the banks and the corporations. There's no question about that whatsoever. Heck, they'll drop money out of helicopters if they have to. Of course, the situation can't last forever. The obscene national debt, the massive derivatives black hole still on the books, and the impending municipal bond crisis will eventually destabilize the rest of the system. And if allowed to run its course with these bailouts and the quantitative easing cushioning the fall, we would be in for a very slow, painful economic death spiral. However, that's not a very likely scenario. As of right now, our present course has us heading towards a third world war. This is where the game will most likely play out unless we take drastic action, and this is where we need to be putting our attention. The showdown that's developing in Syria and Iran, with the US finally acknowledging that military action is being planned, has been in the works for many, many years. The evidence was readily available for those who were willing to take the time to research it.
And U.S. Army General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said he provided President Obama with the options for the use of force in Syria. He said the U.S. is considering what he termed as kinetic strikes in Syria, but he did not go into further details. We see that the war talk is escalating, and not just on this side of the Atlantic. British generals basically echo what the U.S. says, but in even stronger terms.
We talked about this in detail and predicted what was coming in several of our videos, including the road to World War III, and World War III has already begun. Over and over and over again, we've been showing you how China and Russia have been warning the US and NATO not to go down this path, showing you how they've been warning that thermonuclear war could result. And we've shown you that in spite of this, the US has been steadily pushing forward, ignoring the warnings. But why Iran? Well, because Iran is sitting on the world's third largest oil reserves, because they control the Strait of Hormuz, which is the world's most crucial energy transport choke point, with 17 million barrels of oil passing through it each day, and because Iran is not bowing down to the US and NATO. They don't like the petrodollar, and they've been pushing for an alternative. This past year, we showed you this clip, which made it pretty clear that they would find some way to draw Iran into a war.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
The current drive to topple Syria fits with this strategy. Iran and Syria have a mutual defense agreement, and Iran is already sending troops to Syria in their defense. Russia is also signaling its involvement, sending advanced anti-aircraft missiles to the Syrian government, and positioning its naval forces off the coast of Syria. We showed you this clip at the end of 2012, which gave us a hint as to the timetable.
There will also be many, many side effects, all of them adverse, from an Israeli strike. But at the end of the day, if we don't get it done the way the administration's working on it now, which I totally agree with, then we ought to take them out.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, we're working hard. We're working hard.
I said at the end of the day. The end of the day may be next year. It will be next year.
The three individuals in this clip, James Baker, Hillary Clinton, and Charlie Rose, are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization which has been calling for the invasion of Iran for many years now, an organization who has people in positions of power to ensure that it happens.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
The powers that be want to kick this next conflict off very soon, in a matter of months if all goes smoothly. Whether they're able to pull that off is another question. If the United States and NATO go into Syria and the conflict spreads into Iran, the results would be disastrous. This won't be a replay of Iraq or Afghanistan. This will be a whole new level of war. One that will likely draw in China and Russia, and which has the potential to bring the entire planet to utter ruin. Even these so-called powers that be won't be able to control the chain of events that follows. They are quite literally playing chicken with nuclear weapons, gambling all of our lives on their deranged power games. Why? Because the powers that be want to stay in control. And if the economy is allowed to grind to a halt organically, they know that they would lose all leverage in the situation. As conditions worsen, the people would begin to rise up, and it would only be a matter of time before their house of cards falls. To avoid that scenario, they're going to preempt it by engineering a crisis. They're going to knock over the game board like a spoiled brat, using war to bring humanity to its knees, till we're begging for it to stop, till we're begging for a solution. And then, of course, they'll offer that solution, a solution which hands them even more power.
I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency, because the speculation and the complexity of currency has caused some of the irritation, not only among the trading nations, but among individuals. But it's not for me to say how it will happen.
Now, when you really see just how many variables are involved here, and how many of these variables are human decisions, which are impossible to predict, it should be clear that there's no way to pin down the collapse to a definitive date. That said, the escalation in Syria and Iran this next year has the real potential to set off a chain reaction that could very easily bring the global economy to its knees. This could be sparked by a breakdown in the oil supply chain as the transport choke points, the Strait of Hormuz in particular, become battlegrounds, or due to a key oil-producing country such as Saudi Arabia becoming destabilized, or falling into Chinese or Russian control, or due to a nuclear weapon or an EMP being detonated in a key city. Any conflict that involves Iran will inherently cause oil prices to skyrocket, especially if Iran is able to render the Strait of Hormuz impassable. It is in fact a tactic that they are openly preparing to implement. If the economy unravels during this conflict, which is quite likely, the government would have the perfect pretext for a total crackdown, establishing martial law and rooting out political dissidents. This is why they've been preparing along these lines, putting totalitarian laws into place like the NDAA and the Patriot Act, and setting up elaborate systems of surveillance and oppression. Historically, governments have always used the fog of war as a cover to stamp out political opponents and to strengthen the power of the state. As fascinating and frightening as this picture might be, rather than obsessing about when and how this is going to happen, we need to do everything in our power to alter our current course. We must prevent the powers that be from drawing us into a third world war, and we must neutralize their capacity to dictate the chain of events domestically. That's going to require widespread disobedience within the military and the civilian population. In short, we need a revolution. We created a video precisely for this purpose, Revolution and Instruction Manual. Please watch that video and read the books that it recommends. A true popular uprising will not prevent the economy from collapsing, but it's our only chance to prevent the psychopaths that got us into this mess from retaining control over what comes next. And that is the topic of our next video. What comes next? What will replace the current system? If you want to make sure you see that video and other videos to come, subscribe to Storm Clouds Gathering on YouTube. For updates, news, and bonus content, please follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/StormCloudsGathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates. You can find us on Google Plus by doing a search for Storm Clouds Gathering, and our website is stormcloudsgathering.com. The economy is not going to recover. It's not going to bounce back and rise to new heights like the politicians and the media have been trying to convince you. This global recession, or more accurately, this global depression that we've been in this past 5 years, is not a temporary downturn. It's the beginning of the end of an era. If you're watching this video, you're probably curious as to when the system is going to unravel. However, this question can't be answered without looking at the why. The why will determine the how, and the how will determine the when. After the crash of 2008, a lot of people suddenly started caring about things like monetary policy, national debt, and central banking, and they began educating themselves on these topics in order to understand what was happening, and to get some idea of what was coming. In response, scores of internet pundits and self-made economists rose up to answer their questions and to predict when and how the system would fall. Unfortunately, many of these would-be teachers were promoting an outdated worldview that left out the most important variables, and as a result, their predictions fell flat on their face, over and over again. For example, when the Federal Reserve began flooding the economy with cash through the bailouts and its series of quantitative easing, many predicted that this would quickly lead to hyperinflation.